It began with a quiet meeting in Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1941, months before the United States would officially enter the war. As Axis powers swept across Europe and Japanese forces tightened their grip on the Pacific, President Franklin D. Roosevelt recognized a dangerous truth. The United States was blind in a world consumed by deception. Britain had MI6, Germany had the Abwehr, the Soviets had the NKVD, but America had nothing. No intelligence apparatus capable of waging war in the shadows. So, Roosevelt turned to one man, a decorated World War I hero and New York lawyer named William Wild Bill Donovan. Charismatic, ambitious, and unafraid of chaos, Donovan envisioned a new kind of warfare. One fought not just with bombs and bullets, but with lies, sabotage, and spies. By June 1942, his idea had a name: the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, America's first centralized intelligence agency and the forerunner of the CIA. Its mission: to gather intelligence, conduct psychological warfare, and organize resistance behind enemy lines. The OSS was unlike anything the United States had ever built. From its headquarters in the old National Institutes of Health building on 25th Street, Donovan assembled a strange army: Ivy League scholars, Hollywood screenwriters, linguists, chemists, and even safecrackers. Their motto, later whispered with pride and irony, was simple: you can't win a war without spies. At its height, the OSS employed more than 13,000 men and women, operating across Europe, North Africa, and Asia. But in 1942, they were a fledgling force, untested and viewed with suspicion by traditional military leaders. General George C. Marshall called them a bunch of amateurs. J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, despised Donovan and saw his agency as a rival. Yet in the shadows of that skepticism, the OSS began to prove itself. One of its earliest and most haunting operations took place along the rugged coast of Italy, Operation Ginny. In early 1944, the plan was simple in theory. A small team of Italian-American commandos would land by sea and destroy a key railway tunnel near La Spezia, crippling German reinforcements moving toward the front. The men trained in secrecy under the OSS Maritime Unit, today's precursor to the Navy SEALs. They used lightweight collapsible boats, silenced weapons, and German disguises. But as with many OSS missions, secrecy was fragile. On February 22, 1944, Ginny Faustin was launched. 15 men, 2 officers, and 13 enlisted personnel. A navigational error led them to the wrong landing point. The team tried again a week later, on March 22nd, in Operation Ginny II. This time they made it ashore. But disaster awaited. A local villager spotted them hauling explosives and alerted the Germans. Within hours, the entire team was captured by the 135th Fortress Brigade. What followed remains one of the darkest episodes in OSS history. Despite wearing US uniforms and identifying themselves as soldiers, the 15 commandos were executed by firing squad on March 26th, under direct orders from Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. No trial, no report. The men were buried in unmarked graves near the coast. The Germans sent no notification to the Red Cross, a blatant violation of the Geneva Convention. For decades, the truth about Operation Ginny remained buried, classified within sealed OSS files. Families of the men received only terse telegrams, missing in action. It wasn't until 1950, during post-war war crimes investigations, that Allied prosecutors discovered German documents detailing the execution order. In 1951, Kesselring was questioned, but the full extent of his involvement was never prosecuted. By then, the Cold War had begun and priorities had shifted. One haunting question persisted among historians. How were the commandos discovered so quickly? Some theorized a navigational error revealed their landing site. Others believed a German informant inside Italian resistance circles betrayed them. Even today, the operation's betrayal remains unresolved, an early warning of the dangers the OSS would face behind enemy lines. But the sacrifice of those 15 men was not in vain. Their failure forced the OSS to refine its tactics, improve field coordination, and deepen its collaboration with local resistance movements. The lessons of Ginny were written in blood, lessons that would shape every covert mission that followed. By 1944, the OSS had transformed from an experimental unit into a formidable global network, coordinating with British SOE operatives and French partisans. Yet every mission carried the same risk: Exposure, betrayal, and disappearance. Behind the medals and commendations lay a secret war, one fought in the dark, and one that would soon reach deep into Nazi-occupied France. Next came Operation Jedburgh, a mission so secret that even Allied commanders weren't told the full details. Teams of men would jump into enemy territory with nothing but radios, weapons, and the hope that someone, somewhere, would answer their call. And for some, that call would never be answered. The year was 1944. Europe was burning, and the Allies were preparing for the greatest amphibious invasion in history, D-Day. But before the first soldier set foot on the beaches of Normandy, an invisible army was already at work behind enemy lines. They were the men of Operation Jedburgh, a joint effort between the OSS, Britain's Special Operations Executive, and the Free French Forces. Their mission: to unite, arm, and lead local resistance groups against the Nazi occupiers, disrupting German communications and supply lines in the days leading up to the invasion. The Jedburghs, or Jeds, as they came to be known, were unlike any unit before them. Each three-man team included one American or British officer, one French officer, and a radio operator. They would parachute deep into occupied territory, establish contact with resistance fighters, and guide them in acts of sabotage. They carried weapons, demolition gear, and a vital piece of technology: the S-phone, a two-way radio small enough to call Allied command aircraft for supply drops. Their entire existence depended on secrecy, timing, and trust. In May 1944, OSS officer Major William Colby, later to become director of the CIA, trained in England for weeks, preparing for what was known as Operation Jedburgh Team Bruce. "We were told almost nothing," Colby later recalled. "You learned where you were going only the night before. They said, your mission is simple: to organize chaos." On the night of June 6th, just hours after the first paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne landed in Normandy, Jedburgh teams followed, dropping across France under cover of darkness. One of the first to jump was Team Hugh, assigned to the Brittany region. Their mission: to coordinate the local Maquis resistance to ambush German reinforcements moving toward Normandy. They succeeded. Railways were blown, convoys destroyed, and communication lines cut. But success carried a cost. Many teams found themselves hunted by the Gestapo, who quickly realized that these weren't ordinary resistance fighters. They were foreign-trained, highly organized, and armed with British Sten guns and American explosives. In the Loire Valley, Team James, led by French Captain Pierre Fourcault and OSS Lieutenant Vernon Hoppers, was betrayed within days. A local collaborator revealed their drop zone. German forces surrounded their safe house near Tours. Fourcault was captured and later executed in Fresnes prison. Hoppers disappeared, presumed dead. For decades, the exact details of his fate remained unknown. Recently declassified documents hint that he may have been transported to Buchenwald, where Allied prisoners were executed in secret in the final months of the war. Still, for every loss, dozens of small victories turned the tide of the invasion. A single Jedburgh team could organize hundreds of resistance fighters. In the days following D-Day, they directed sabotage operations that crippled German reinforcements. In one instance, a Jedburgh team known as Andrew destroyed a bridge near Limoges, delaying an entire armoured column by 48 hours, precious time that allowed Allied troops to secure the Normandy beachhead. The OSS and SOE maintained strict secrecy. Jedburgh teams operated under aliases. Even their own headquarters rarely knew their exact locations. One internal OSS memo read, "Do not inquire further into Jedburgh operations. Information flows only one way." This secrecy, while essential, also meant that when teams vanished, no one could come looking for them. Entire groups disappeared into the fog of war, their names crossed out, their missions marked incomplete. For the families back home, silence became the cruelest weapon. Letters went unanswered. Reports were classified. Some operatives were buried under assumed names in French villages, honored only by those they helped free. Others were simply never found. After the war, investigators recovered fragments, broken radios, blood-stained maps, and coded notebooks. Evidence of the hidden war waged by men who officially didn't exist. Despite the losses, Operation Jedburgh proved to be one of the most successful covert undertakings of World War II. Eisenhower later credited the French resistance, supported by the OSS and SOE, with delaying up to 10 German divisions from reaching Normandy in the weeks following the invasion. Yet behind this triumph, questions lingered. How many teams were betrayed? Who within the complex web of Allied and local networks had turned? Years later, newly declassified OSS documents revealed the presence of double agents within the French resistance, some working secretly for German intelligence. Others, perhaps unknowingly, passed information through compromised channels. The war in the shadows was never clean. It was fought with mistrust, secrets, and sacrifice. In the end, the Jedburghs became a blueprint for modern special operations. The spiritual ancestors of the Green Berets and the CIA's paramilitary branches. Their story was one of courage, but also of mystery. For some, their names live on in OSS archives. For others, their graves remain unmarked, lost in the forests and villages of occupied France. As the Allies pushed east and the liberation of France began, the OSS's focus shifted beyond Europe, toward a new front of intrigue and risk. A mission half a world away, where diplomacy and danger collided, in the jungles and skies of Southeast Asia. Its name was Operation Cardinal, and unlike the Jedburghs, this one would end without a trace. By early 1945, the war in Europe was approaching its brutal climax. But in Asia, the conflict was far from over. Japan's empire still stretched from Burma to the Pacific Islands, and its grip on Southeast Asia remained ironclad. While Allied armies pushed north through the Philippines and toward Okinawa, another, quieter battle was unfolding. A race for information, influence, and survival deep inside the jungles of French Indochina. For the men of the OSS, this was enemy territory unlike any they had faced before. It was a land of dense rainforests, unfamiliar languages, and deadly political currents. The mission that would become known as Operation Cardinal began not with gunfire, but with whispers, rumors of Vichy-aligned scientists and diplomats trapped in Indochina, and the possibility that they held valuable intelligence on Japanese chemical warfare research. The goal was simple in theory: locate and extract key French and Vietnamese scientists before the Japanese occupation tightened its final grip. But nothing in Indochina was ever simple. The region was fractured, part French colonial rule, part Japanese military control, and laced with a growing nationalist movement led by the enigmatic Ho Chi Minh, who was himself covertly in contact with OSS agents under the codename Lucius. In February 1945, OSS headquarters in Kunming, China, authorized the mission under the Far East Division, codenamed Cardinal Fulb. The operation would deploy a small extraction team, 3 Americans, 2 French agents, and a local pilot familiar with the terrain, flying a modified C-47 transport plane under the insignia of the China-Burma-India Theatre. The team's commanding officer, Captain Robert Bobby Alton, was a veteran of several dangerous reconnaissance runs over Burma. His orders were written by hand, with no carbon copy: retrieve assets from Indochina before Japanese takeover, operate under full denial, no acknowledgement in event of capture. From the start, the mission faced near impossible odds. Japanese forces were advancing rapidly through northern Vietnam, tightening control of the airfields and river routes that the OSS team would need. Their intended extraction point, an abandoned French plantation near Haiphong, had already fallen into Japanese hands. The team was forced to alter its route mid-flight, guided by radio intercepts from OSS outposts in southern China. At 2200 hours on March 11, 1945, Cardinal 5 took off from a secret runway outside Kunming. It would be the last time anyone saw them. According to flight records, their final transmission came 90 minutes after takeoff. Cloud cover heavy, diverting south. After that, silence. Days later, OSS listening posts along the Chinese border picked up fragments of coded Japanese transmissions, references to an enemy aircraft downed near the coast, and 6 foreign agents captured alive. No names, no coordinates. The message vanished into Tokyo's encrypted networks. Despite extensive search flights, no wreckage was ever found. The disappearance of Operation Cardinal haunted OSS officers for decades. In the official post-war report, the entry was brief and chilling. Mission failed, personnel presumed lost at sea. Yet years later, conflicting reports began to surface. A French colonial administrator claimed to have seen American prisoners move through Hanoi under heavy guard in April 1945. Another account, declassified in 1983, described Japanese records referencing foreign scientists and collaborators detained near Saigon. Could the Cardinal team have been taken alive? If so, what did they know that justified such secrecy? One surviving OSS cable, dated April 17, 1945, offers a cryptic clue. Information from Hanoi contact indicates Cardinal team compromised by diplomatic channels, possible French involvement. The phrase diplomatic channels suggested that someone within Vichy's colonial network may have tipped off the Japanese, either to curry favor or eliminate rivals, but no definitive proof was ever found. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, US investigators scoured French Indochina for traces of the missing team. They found remnants, a fragment of a C-47 wing in the jungle near Lang Son, a rusted .45 caliber sidearm engraved with American markings, and a torn section of an OSS field manual. No bodies, no dog tags, just artifacts swallowed by the rainforest. For years, the case of Operation Cardinal remained sealed under confidential Far East. 1945. When files were finally declassified in the late 1970s, historians were struck by the abrupt ending. Pages redacted, names erased, and no final conclusion. Some believed the team was executed by the Japanese shortly before the war's end. Others suggested they were secretly absorbed into post-war intelligence operations as the US shifted its focus toward containing communism in Asia. One haunting passage from Donovan's private memo in September 1945 reads, "Cardinal was lost not to the jungle, but to politics." It hints that the mission's true objective may have gone far beyond rescuing scientists, possibly involving early contact with Vietnamese, nationalist factions that would later shape the Cold War, struggle in Southeast Asia. Today, no memorial stands for the Cardinal operatives. Their mission remains a shadow in the OSS archives, a story of ambition, betrayal, and silence. The coordinates of their final flight are still unconfirmed, their fate unresolved. But their disappearance marked a turning point. It reminded the OSS that information could be more dangerous than any weapon, and that in the fog of war, some secrets were meant to vanish. As 1945 drew to a close, another kind of secrecy began. Not in the jungles of Asia, but in the ruined laboratories of Germany. A new operation was underway, one that would redefine the moral boundaries of victory itself. It was called Operation Paperclip, and it would test how far the OSS was willing to go in the name of progress. In the spring of 1945, Germany was collapsing. The Red Army pressed from the east, the Western Allies advanced from the west, and Hitler's once mighty Reich was disintegrating city by city. Amid the rubble, a new kind of race began, one not for territory, but for minds. The weapons of tomorrow, both literal and scientific, were buried in the laboratories and factories of the Third Reich, and the OSS, ever watchful, was determined to claim them before the Soviets did. This was the beginning of Maoist. Operation Paperclip. One of the most secret and morally ambiguous missions of World War II's final days. Officially, it was called the Foreign Scientists Program, designed to extract German scientists, engineers, and technicians who could advance American technology in the post-war era. Unofficially, it was a desperate scramble to control the knowledge that had built Germany's V-2 rockets, jet engines, nerve agents, and early nuclear research. For the OSS, this was a new frontier. Intelligence not just as information, but as power. The origins of Paperclip can be traced to a small, plain building in London known as the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, CIOS. There, Allied analysts compiled lists of priority targets, laboratories, research institutes, and individuals whose work could tip the balance in future warfare. Men like Wernher von Braun, the young German rocket scientist who had designed the V-2 missiles that terrorized London. His expertise in propulsion was unmatched. His facility at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast had become a fortress of innovation and atrocity. Thousands of prisoners from Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp had died building his rockets. To Donovan's OSS, von Braun and his team represented both an opportunity and a risk. The Soviets were only days behind. Intelligence intercepts showed Red Army units closing in on Peenemünde by early May. A secret OSS cable dated April 28, 1945, read simply, "Secure technical staff at all costs. political vetting secondary. It was an order that would define the operation's dark legacy. As US forces advanced through Germany, OSS technical intelligence units, known as T-forces, swept across the country. They operated in civilian clothes, carrying lists of names and coordinates rather than rifles. Their instructions were to locate scientists, secure their research, and bring them safely into American hands. Within weeks, more than 1,500 German scientists and engineers were identified as priority targets. But many were also implicated in war crimes. Here, the paperclip came in, quite literally. To bypass strict US immigration and military policies that barred anyone associated with the Nazi Party or SS, OSS officers attached small paperclips to the files of certain scientists. The clip indicated their records had been modified, names cleansed, affiliations erased. It was a quiet signal that these men, despite their pasts, were now assets. Among them was Dr. Hubertus Strughold, who had overseen medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners under the Luftwaffe. He would later be hailed as the father of space medicine in the United States. Another was Arthur Rudolph, who supervised forced labor at the Mittelwerk factory and went on to direct NASA's Saturn V rocket program. The contradictions were staggering. Heroes of American science, who had once served the Reich, the OSS justified its actions through the lens of the coming Cold War. As General Donovan wrote in one of his final memos before the agency's dissolution, "The German scientist today is the Russian scientist tomorrow." To Washington, ideological purity mattered less than technological advantage. The moral line blurred under the weight of strategic necessity. The extraction process was a logistical feat. Dozens of convoys moved through southern Germany, escorting scientists and their families to temporary internment centers. Some were housed at Camp Overcast, later renamed Fort Bliss, Texas. Others were quietly integrated into US military research facilities. Von Braun's team, known as the Paperclip Rockets, was transported first to Garmisch, then to Paris, and finally to the United States in late 1945. Publicly, the program did not exist. Even high-ranking military officers were kept in the dark. Official documents described these men as technical consultants, their Nazi affiliations omitted or falsified. It wasn't until years later that investigative journalists discovered the truth, that America's early space program had been built, in part on the expertise of men who once served Hitler. Yet for all its controversy, Paperclip's success was undeniable. The V-2 rocket became the foundation of American ballistic missile research. Within a decade, those same principles would propel the first US satellite, and later the Apollo missions, into space. But beneath that triumph lay a deep and unresolved question. How much moral compromise is acceptable in the pursuit of progress? Many OSS veterans who had risked their lives in Europe viewed Paperclip with unease. These were the same officers who had witnessed Nazi brutality firsthand. And now they were escorting its architects to freedom. "We won the war," one anonymous OSS officer wrote in 1946, "but we lost a piece of our soul doing it." As the OSS dissolved later that year, replaced by the newly created Central Intelligence Group, and eventually the CIA, thousands of files were destroyed. The details of Paperclip were buried under layers of secrecy. It would take decades for the truth to emerge, as declassified documents revealed just how far the operation had gone. But not everything could be erased. In the vaults of the National Archives, a single memorandum from 1945 bears Donovan's signature and one final, cryptic note: "Preserve knowledge, eliminate evidence." That phrase would define the OSS's final chapter, the deliberate destruction of its own records, and the silencing of the men and women who had waged America's first shadow war. The year was 1945. The war was ending, but the secrets, the betrayals, and the ghosts of those missions, they were only just beginning to surface. The summer of 1945 should have brought closure. The guns had fallen silent, Berlin lay in ruins, and across the world, the victors of World War II were celebrating the dawn of peace. But within the dimly lit corridors of Washington and London, another war had already begun. One fought not with armies, but with secrets. The OSS, its wartime purpose fulfilled, faced dissolution. Yet before it disappeared, Director William Wild Bill Donovan issued one final order: to secure its legacies and protect the identities of those who had fought the invisible battles of the war. That command would spark one of the most mysterious and consequential acts in modern intelligence history: the deliberate destruction and concealment of OSS archives. It was an operation few understood at the time, and fewer still survive to explain. In September 1945, President Truman signed Executive Order 9621, officially dissolving the OSS. Its functions were divided. Intelligence analysis was handed to the State Department, while operational assets transferred to the newly formed Strategic Services Unit under the War Department. But what to do with the thousands of files, coded communications, mission reports, lists of foreign contacts, and agent dossiers that documented the OSS's vast shadow war? For Donovan, the answer was simple. Many of these records, he believed, were too sensitive ever to see daylight. "Our enemies are defeated," he wrote in a private memorandum, "but the war of secrets has no end." The concern was not just about foreign adversaries, but about political exposure. The OSS had operated with extraordinary latitude: covert funding, unauthorized missions, and foreign alliances that skirted diplomatic law. If revealed, they could embarrass governments and endanger those still in the field. And so, across Europe and Asia, the order went out: burn everything not essential to continuity. In Paris, OSS officer Virginia Hall, the legendary limping lady once hunted by the Gestapo, supervised the destruction of her French network's records. Agents' real names were replaced with numbers. Entire missions vanished into smoke-filled barrels behind safe houses. In Rome, OSS detachment leaders burned crates of communications logs and microfilm, erasing years of clandestine correspondence. At Ceylon, the OSS India missions files, documenting covert links with anti-colonial movements, were reportedly dumped into the Indian Ocean. The purpose was protection, but the effect was obliteration. Whole operations disappeared from history. Among them were the field reports from Operation Ginny, the files on missing Jedburgh teams, and the last transmissions of an Operation Cardinal. Even internal memoranda regarding Operation Paperclip, the recruitment of German scientists, were heavily redacted or destroyed. Donovan himself was said to have personally reviewed and marked files for elimination with the handwritten notation: "Purge for security." Not everyone agreed. Brigadier General John Magruder, head of the new Strategic Services Unit, argued that the OSS's records were the foundation of modern intelligence. To him, destruction meant amnesia. "If we burn our history," Magruder warned, "we burn the lessons we bled to learn." Yet his protests were limited by politics. Post-war America was weary of espionage, and Truman himself distrusted Donovan's men, calling them cloak and dagger amateurs. In October 1945, hundreds of OSS officers were dismissed, their offices sealed, and their files trucked away to temporary government warehouses. What wasn't destroyed was hidden. A cache of microfilm copies was secretly transferred to a secure vault in the Department of War under the codename the Black Ledger. The existence of the ledger remained unconfirmed for decades, though declassified CIA correspondence from the 1970s hints that it contained index fragments of terminated OSS operations. If true, it was one of the only surviving traces of the organization's most secret missions, a map to the buried history of America's first espionage service. Meanwhile, the remnants of the OSS lived on through its people. Men like Alan Dulles, who had run the OSS station in Switzerland, would soon help found the Central Intelligence Agency. Others, trained saboteurs, analysts, field agents, vanished into civilian life, their wartime deeds unspoken. The world saw them as ordinary citizens. Only their memories carried the weight of invisible wars. Many never even told their families what they had done. In 1947, when the CIA was finally established, a handful of these OSS veterans returned to service. Their experiences became the template for America's Cold War intelligence doctrine: covert action, psychological warfare, and global surveillance. But their origins remained deliberately obscured. The destruction of the OSS files ensured that the agency's full story, its triumphs, its failures, its betrayals, would never be completely known. Over the following decades, fragments of the truth began to resurface. Declassified papers hinted at lost operations, unnamed heroes, and unacknowledged sacrifices. Yet each discovery raised more questions than answers. What else had been hidden? What names had been erased forever? In one surviving letter to a former operative, Donovan wrote poignantly, "History will not remember us, and that is how it must be. The shadows do not seek credit." But history inevitably seeks light. In the 1980s and 1990s, researchers uncovered small remnants of the burned records, carbon copies, mission summaries, and field maps that had survived by accident. They revealed a tantalizing picture. The OSS had not simply been a wartime experiment. It had been the seed of a global intelligence network whose influence stretched long after the last shot of World War II was fired. Yet for all that was recovered, much remains lost. The names of agents who vanished, the details of missions that ended in silence, the truth behind coded entries labeled unknown. These are the ghosts of the OSS, men and women who fought in secret and were buried in secrecy. Their stories remind us that victory in war often demands the loss of truth, that sometimes the price of freedom is the erasure of those who secured it. But not all secrets stay buried forever. In the years that followed, historians and archivists would begin to unearth the fragments of this hidden legacy. And from those fragments, a shadowy mosaic of 5 lost OSS missions would slowly emerge, revealing that the real story of the Office of Strategic Services was not about what it built, but what it chose to hide. By 1946, the dust of World War II had settled over a scarred planet. Cities lay in ruins, nations were reshaped, and millions were displaced. Yet amid the rebuilding, one war had not ended. It had merely changed form. The silent conflict of espionage and deception, born in the chaos of global war, was about to evolve into something far greater and much darker. The OSS officially dissolved, left behind no public legacy, no official memorial. Its existence became a rumor whispered among veterans and diplomats, but in reality, its spirit and many of its secrets had survived. The story of the OSS did not conclude with surrender. It dissolved into the bloodstream of history, transforming into the global intelligence machinery of the Cold War. Yet much of what it achieved and what it hid remained locked away, sealed in files stamped "Top Secret, Eyes Only." The men and women who had risked their lives behind enemy lines were ordered into silence. Some returned to quiet suburban lives, others vanished into newly formed intelligence services, and a few, those whose missions had never officially existed, simply disappeared from record. The official closure came in January 1946. A small ceremony was held in Washington, D.C., attended by a handful of high-ranking officers. William Wild Bill Donovan, the man who had conceived the OSS, stood before his dwindling staff and said quietly, "You can take pride in the fact that you served in the greatest intelligence organization that ever existed." Then, turning to his aides, he added with bitter foresight, "But we must not expect gratitude. The shadows never get medals." Even as the OSS's name faded, its work continued under new guises. The Strategic Services Unit, SSU, absorbed what remained of the network, operating in absolute secrecy under the War Department. Former OSS stations in Vienna, Berlin, and Shanghai stayed active, gathering intelligence on Soviet movements and post-war black markets. The same clandestine circuits that had once supported anti-Nazi partisans were now tracking communist agents and defectors. The lines between wartime heroism and peacetime espionage blurred beyond recognition, but the destruction of OSS files and the deliberate concealment of many of its missions left a void in history. What truly happened to the men of Operation Ginny? Who betrayed the Jedburgh teams in France? Did the Cardinal operatives die in the jungles of Indochina, or were they silenced to protect a larger secret? The more historians searched, the more contradictions they found. The OSS had fought not just a war of intelligence, but a war against its own disappearance. In the decades that followed, fragments began to re-emerge. During the 1950s, the newly formed CIA quietly declassified select OSS reports to support its operations in Korea and Vietnam. Among these were the first references to Operation Cardinal, noted simply as Unresolved Probable Loss, Southeast Asia, March 1945. In the 1970s, amid the era of government transparency and investigative journalism, a small cache of OSS documents was discovered in a warehouse in Suitland, Maryland, including one carbon copy of a destroyed field report from Italy dated March 1944, Ginny II. It contained hand-drawn maps, coded radio frequencies, and a chilling margin note. All men accounted for, dead. By the 1990s, declassification efforts revealed further details, not of glory, but of erasure. Historians uncovered deliberate redactions, missing names, and altered mission summaries. The evidence suggested a calculated effort to protect not just agents, but the entire moral narrative of the war. The OSS's clandestine campaigns had blurred into the moral fog of necessity, where betrayal could be called strategy, and truth could be labeled dangerous. The more researchers dug, the clearer one thing became. The OSS was not merely an intelligence agency. It was an experiment, a prototype of the modern deep state, operating beyond traditional accountability. It fought wars that governments would later deny, and made decisions that reshaped entire regions without public consent. And when those wars ended, the agency simply vanished, leaving behind stories too complex, too dangerous and too human to fit into the clean lines of history. Today, many of those stories are finally being pieced together through diaries, declassified memos, and eyewitness accounts. We now know that more than 500 OSS operatives never returned from their missions. Some were captured and executed, others disappeared in the chaos of liberation. Their names are carved into a quiet marble wall at the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, a memorial that bears no agency title, only the words, "In honor of those who gave their lives in silence." But perhaps the greatest mystery of all lies not in what the OSS did, but in what it left behind, the methods, the ethos, and the invisible culture that shaped decades of intelligence operations to come. From the Cold War's covert coups to modern counterterrorism, the fingerprints of Donovan's secret army can still be traced, hidden in plain sight. In the end, the OSS's story is not one of disappearance, but transformation. Its secrets became the scaffolding of a new world order, one ruled as much by information as by power, and its legacy, though buried in classified vaults and forgotten missions, continues to haunt the corridors of intelligence agencies across the globe. The war that the OSS fought may have ended in 1945, but the shadow war it created, the war of secrecy, deception, and hidden truths, has never ended. Because once secrets are born, they rarely die. They only wait, deep in the archives, behind redacted lines and lost files, to be found again.